Shannon Lloyd and Renee Cuevas. Two women were killed in Orange County 2 years apart. A crime lab proved the same man did both. Then the trail went silent for almost 20 years, until a family tree revealed a name no detective had ever written down. Shannon Rose Lloyd was 23 years old and rented a bedroom in Garden Grove, California, on May 21, 1987. She was attacked and killed inside that room. The Garden Grove Police Department opened the investigation, gathered what evidence they could, and got nowhere. There was no obvious suspect and no clear motive. Shannon Lloyd's case went cold. Then it happened again. On the morning of February 19, 1989, the body of Renee Cuevas, 27, was discovered along Lambert Road near a former Marine base in Irvine. She had been killed. This second case fell to the Orange County Sheriff's Department, and the two agencies worked their files separately, with no reason yet to connect them. What does it take to prove that two crimes in two cities are the work of one person? It took the science finally catching up. In 2003, the Orange County Crime Lab developed a male DNA profile from evidence at Shannon Lloyd's scene. When they compared it against the Cuevas case, the profiles matched. The lab had confirmed something chilling. The same man had killed both women, but knowing the killings were linked and knowing who did them are two very different things. The DNA profile was run through the national database. It returned nothing. No name, no record, no match. And so, even with the cases now joined, they sat cold for almost 2 more decades. The break did not come from a new witness or a fresh tip. It came from genealogy. In 2021, the Orange County District Attorney's Office had built an in-house investigative genetic genealogy team, a unit dedicated to taking unknown crime scene DNA and tracing it through the branches of family trees built from public databases. The team took the profile that had gone unidentified for years and began the slow work of building outward, generation by generation, until the branches narrowed to a single person. The name was Reuben J. Smith. Smith had lived in Orange County during the 1980s, the exact window of both killings, before relocating to Las Vegas, and there was a reason his DNA could be confirmed at all. In 1998, Smith had been arrested in Las Vegas in connection with an attack on a third woman, one who survived. Those Nevada charges were later dismissed, but his booking DNA had been retained in the system. When investigators compared that retained sample to the crime scene DNA from both Shannon Lloyd and Renee Cuevas, it matched. The genealogy had pointed the way, and the old booking sample sealed it. How do you bring a man to justice who was never even a suspect? In this case, you cannot. Reuben J. Smith was already dead. He had taken his own life in 1999 at the age of 39 in Las Vegas. He had been gone for more than 20 years before the family tree ever led back to him. For 3 decades, across 2 separate investigations, his name had never once landed on a detective's list. He had simply lived and then died, outside the reach of everyone trying to find him. When the cases were announced as solved in July of 2022, the third woman, the one who had survived the 1998 attack in Las Vegas, came forward publicly. She put words to what the 2 women who did not survive could never describe. She spoke of the evil she had seen in him and said she had known that if she did not fight, she was going to die. Her account gave the investigation something it had never had before, a living voice describing the man behind the DNA. There was no trial because there was no living defendant. The cases were closed administratively. The Orange County District Attorney, summing up the meaning of a 35-year pursuit, said simply that justice does not have an expiration date. Garden Grove police continue to ask anyone who knew Reuben Smith in the 1980s to come forward because they suspect his crimes may not have stopped at the 2 women they had finally connected to him. In the next case, the suspect was never a mystery. The mystery was whether the evidence would survive long enough to convict him. George and Catherine Peacock. An elderly couple was killed in their quiet Vermont home. Within 2 weeks, police had a suspect. It would take more than 30 years, a single drop of blood, and a modern lab to make the case. And then a judge nearly undid all of it. George Peacock was 76 years old, a man of small, dependable habits. Every day he picked up a copy of the local newspaper. His wife, Catherine, was 73. The couple lived a quiet life together in Danby, Vermont, the kind of life that does not generate headlines. In mid-September of 1989, both George and Catherine Peacock were killed inside their home. Their bodies were not discovered right away. It was a neighbor who finally raised the alarm on September 17th, after George had failed to appear at his usual newspaper stop for several days in a row. When investigators entered the house, they found no signs of forced entry, and nothing of significance had been taken. Whoever had come into that home had not broken in and had not come for money. If a stranger did not force the door, then who did the couple let inside? The investigation moved quickly toward an answer. Within 2 weeks, police had developed circumstantial evidence pointing to the Peacocks' own son-in-law, Michael Anthony Louise, who lived in the Syracuse, New York area and was married to the couple's daughter. Louise gave investigators inconsistent accounts about a planned drive to Vermont on the day of the killings. A relative told police that Louise had described blacking out after crossing into Vermont. He left his wife 2 notes that police read as messages professing his innocence, with one mentioning that he had thrown a gun into a river. And then there was the physical evidence. In October of 1989, investigators seized a floor mat from the couple's car. On that mat was a single drop of blood. At the time, DNA testing on that small spot was inconclusive. The technology of 1989 simply could not extract an answer from a stain that size. The case, despite a named suspect, could not be closed. It went cold and stayed that way for decades. The investigation never fully let go of Louise, but it never had the proof to move against him either. Could one drop of blood, preserved for more than 30 years, still hold the truth? In May of 2020, the Vermont State Police resubmitted that blood spot for modern DNA testing at the State Forensic Lab. The science had advanced enormously since 1989. This time, the lab pulled a usable profile from the stain, and the major profile matched the blood of George Peacock. The drop of blood on the son-in-law's car floor mat belonged to one of the victims. In October of 2022, Michael Anthony Louise was arrested in Syracuse at the age of 79 and charged with 2 counts of murder. He pleaded not guilty, but this case carried a twist that had nothing to do with finding the killer and everything to do with proving it. In February of 2026, a Vermont judge threw the blood DNA evidence out of the case. The ruling did not say the science was wrong. It said the chain of custody could no longer be authenticated. The trooper who had originally collected the floor mat back in 1989 and the original lead detective from Vermont had both since died. With no one alive to testify to how that piece of evidence had been handled across 3 decades, the judge ruled it could not be trusted in court. He reduced the defendant's bail to $100. How do you convict a man when your best evidence dies along with the people who collected it? That question is now the entire case. The state is appealing the decision to the Vermont Supreme Court, fighting to get the DNA evidence reinstated. The defense has moved to dismiss the charges altogether. The defendant, now in his 80s and in poor health, lives under court order in a skilled nursing facility, while the trial sits frozen, waiting on the higher court. A case that took 30 years and a single drop of blood to build now waits to see whether it will be allowed to exist at all. The next case proves how far the science had come by reaching back even further into the past. Marie-Anne Chivarella. A young girl left home on a winter morning carrying canned goods for a school food drive. She never reached her classroom. Her case stayed unsolved for so long that the technology used to crack it had not been invented when she died. Maurice Ann Chivarella was a student at a parochial school in Hazleton, Pennsylvania. Her family remembered her as shy and sweet, a child who was learning to play the organ and who hoped one day to become a nun. On the morning of March 18, 1964, Maurice left her Hazleton home a little after 8 o'clock, carrying canned goods to donate to a food drive at her school. She never arrived. Around 1 o'clock that afternoon, a man giving his nephew a driving lesson spotted what he first took to be a large doll lying in a waste coal pit in Hazel Township. It was not a doll. It was Maurice, more than 2 miles from her home. She had been killed. How does a child travel 2 miles from her own street in the space of a single morning? The investigation was enormous. Over the years, more than 230 members of the Pennsylvania State Police worked the case at one point or another. None of it produced the answer. Detectives chased leads through the town and beyond it, and every promising thread eventually frayed to nothing. The case went cold and remained that way for decades, a permanent open wound in the town of Hazleton. Then the evidence began to speak. In 2007, the Pennsylvania State Police DNA lab developed a male suspect profile from biological evidence preserved on Maurice's jacket. The jacket had been kept all those years, and the science had finally advanced enough to read it. Investigators entered that profile into the national database and checked it month after month. Year after year, it returned no match. The killer was not in the system, and a conventional database search would never find him. What do you do when the evidence holds a perfect answer, but no question that fits it? The answer came from genetic genealogy. In 2018, the company Parabon Nanolabs uploaded the suspect's profile to a public genealogy database. In 2019, a very distant relative surfaced, possibly a sixth cousin, the faintest thread imaginable. The following year, a young genealogist named Eric Schubert, then a college history student who had taught himself the craft as a sick child watching ancestry commercials on television, volunteered to help. He spent 2 years building family trees outward from that distant match, painstakingly assembling generations of names until the branches began to converge. The work narrowed the suspect pool to 4 men. One name rose above the others: James Paul Fort. To be certain, investigators took an extraordinary step. In January of 2022, James Paul Fort's body was exhumed. On February 3rd, his DNA was compared to the crime scene sample. It matched. On February 10th, 2022, the case was announced as solved. 58 years after Maurice Chivarella was killed, James Paul Fort had been a bartender and bar supplies salesman who lived only 6 or 7 blocks from Maurice. He had no known connection to her family. He had died in May of 1980 of natural causes at the age of 38. He had been dead for more than 4 decades by the time his name was finally spoken. At the press conference announcing the resolution, a state police corporal placed the case in history, explaining that it was the 4th oldest cold case ever solved in the country using genetic genealogy, and the oldest in the state of Pennsylvania. The corporal also noted that Forte had a prior record, including a guilty plea to aggravated assault in 1974, for which he served a year of probation. There was no trial. The man responsible had been beyond the reach of any court for over 40 years. But for a family who had waited 58 years, the case finally had a name, and the question that had hung over Hazleton for generations finally had an answer. Investigators have said Fort may have harmed others, and tips are still being accepted. The next case was also built on the patience of a family and the work of a company that could read DNA the old labs could not. Linda O'Keefe. A young girl walked home from summer school on a July afternoon and vanished. A turquoise van had been seen circling. For 45 years, her case haunted a police department, until DNA drew a face out of thin air. Linda Ann O'Keefe was a Girl Scout from Corona del Mar, California, a child who loved painting and piano. On July 6, 1973, she walked home from summer school after her mother told her she was busy that afternoon. She was wearing a white sundress patterned with light blue flowers, a dress her own mother had made for her. Linda never made it home. Earlier that day, witnesses had noticed a turquoise van circling the area. One eyewitness reported seeing Linda standing beside that van, speaking with a man who appeared to be in his mid-20s to early 30s. The next morning, two men riding bicycles found Linda's body in a ditch along Back Bay Drive. She had been killed. How does a child disappear in broad daylight, in plain view of a quiet neighborhood? The case became one that the Newport Beach Police Department could never let go of. Linda's photograph hung in the detective division for decades, passed from one generation of investigators to the next, a quiet reminder of the answer they had never found. Detectives chased the case for 45 years without ever identifying the man with the van. Leads were followed and exhausted, and the turquoise van itself was never traced. The crime scene DNA sat as the one piece of evidence that might one day speak if the science ever caught up. Then, in July of 2018, on the 45th anniversary of her death, the department tried something new. Working with Parabon Nanolabs, they released DNA phenotype sketches, computer predictions of the killer's likely eye color, hair color, and skin tone, generated directly from the crime scene DNA. The department paired the campaign with a day-long retelling of Linda's final hours on social media, written in her imagined voice, to bring fresh public attention to a case the world had forgotten. Could decades-old DNA actually point to a single living man? It could. Parabon Nanolabs uploaded the suspect's DNA profile to a genealogy database, and in January of 2019, the genealogical work produced a hit. Investigators built out the family tree branch by branch, identified a suspect, placed him under surveillance, and waited for him to discard something they could test without alerting him. When they recovered that discarded item, the DNA on it was a direct match to the crime scene profile that had waited 45 years for a name. The man was James Allen Neal, and he was 72 years old. At the time of Linda's death in 1973, Neal had been working in construction in Orange County, but he had been living under a different name entirely. After an incident in Florida, he had changed his name to James Allen Neal, shedding his old identity and, for 45 years, slipping out from under the case. That single change of name had kept him invisible while a department searched for him across 4.5 decades. On February 19, 2019, he was arrested in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Beyond Linda's case, he was also charged in Riverside County with harming 2 other young people in the years between 1995 and 2004. He pleaded not guilty. Would the O'Keefe family finally get to see a trial? They would not. On May 27, 2020, James Allen Neal died in custody at the age of 73 of an undisclosed illness while still awaiting trial. The breakthrough had identified him. The arrest had been made, but death took him before a jury ever could. The charges against him were abated by his death, and the case was administratively closed without a verdict ever being reached. For Linda's family, the closure was incomplete, but it was not nothing. The Newport Beach police chief said plainly that it had been the department's intention to see James Allen Neal stand trial. Linda's older sister said that after all the years of not knowing, simply finding out that there was a face and a name brought additional closure. After 45 years, the man with the turquoise van was no longer a ghost. He had a name, even if he never had a verdict. The next case shows what happens when the science arrives in time and the courtroom gets its chance. Carla Walker. A teenager was taken from a car outside a bowling alley on the night of a Valentine's dance. Her boyfriend survived the attack. For 46 years, he lived under a cloud of suspicion until a Texas lab read DNA no one else could. Carla John Walker was 17 years old, a junior cheerleader at Western Hills High School in Fort Worth, Texas. On February 16, 1974, the night of a Valentine's dance, Carla and her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, parked at a bowling alley after the dance ended. They were not alone for long. An attacker yanked open the passenger door of the car. He struck Rodney McCoy with a pistol, knocking him unconscious, and then he took Carla. 3 days later, on February 19th, her body was found in a culvert near Lake Benbrook. She had been killed. How do you catch a man who left almost nothing behind but a sleeping witness? Investigators did have one lead. At the parking lot, police recovered a magazine from a .22 caliber Ruger pistol. A man named Glenn Samuel McCurley owned a Ruger that matched, and he lived only blocks from the bowling alley. When detectives questioned him in 1974, McCurley told them the gun had been stolen 6 weeks earlier while he was away fishing. He passed a polygraph examination. He was eliminated as a suspect, and so the case went cold for 46 years. For nearly half a century, the heaviest burden fell on Rodney McCoy, the boyfriend who had survived. He had been the last person with Carla, and suspicion clung to him for 50 years, a life lived under the shadow of a crime he did not commit. Could a case this old, with evidence this degraded, ever truly be solved? Carla's brother, Jim Walker, refused to let the case die, working it for decades and keeping it alive long after the original investigators had moved on. The investigation eventually drew the attention of renowned investigator Paul Holes, who featured it on a television series. Holes connected the Fort Worth detectives with Othram, a forensic lab in the Woodlands, Texas, that specialized in pulling DNA profiles from samples too damaged or too small for conventional testing. The television program covered the cost of the testing. Using its advanced genome sequencing on degraded DNA recovered from Carla's clothing, evidence that older labs had never been able to read, Othram built a profile and traced it through genealogy. In July of 2020, Othram's chief executive called the lead detective with the result. He told him the DNA had been connected to a particular family tree and that the last name was McCurley. It was the same name from 1974. The man who had been cleared by a polygraph was now at the center of the case. Police pulled trash from McCurley's curb and the DNA matched. McCurley later voluntarily provided a cheek swab, and the lab confirmed the match a second time. On September 21st, 2020, Glenn Samuel McCurley, then 77 years old, was arrested and charged with capital murder. Prosecutors would later choose not to pursue the death penalty. What had McCurley been hiding for 46 years? When police searched his home, they found their answer in a hidden compartment above a door. It was the .22 caliber Ruger, the same gun McCurley had told detectives in 1974 had been stolen while he was away fishing. He had kept it concealed in his own home for 46 years, the single object that tied him to the night Carla Walker was taken. McCurley pleaded not guilty, but on the third day of his trial, in August of 2021, after damning testimony and a recorded confession, he changed his plea to guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He had been a retired truck driver, married since 1963, a father of two and a regular churchgoer, a man whose ordinary and respectable life had concealed the case for nearly half a century. He died behind bars of natural causes in July of 2023 at the age of 80. The case inspired federal legislation, the Carla Walker Act, aimed at funding the very forensic genetic genealogy work that had finally caught him. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The next case carried that same science into the home of another young mother whose killer had hidden in plain sight. Kathy Swartz. A young mother was killed in her own apartment while her infant daughter slept unharmed in the next room. There were no signs of a break-in. For 35 years, the killer lived a clean, ordinary life until a family tree pulled him out of it. Kathy Sue Swartz was 19 years old, a young mother living in Three Rivers, Michigan. She had a 9-month-old daughter named Courtney and shared an apartment with her fiancé, Mike Warner. People who knew Kathy remembered her as a sweet tomboy, someone who hunted with her father and who had a real gift for art. On December 2nd, 1988, Mike Warner came home from work and found Kathy killed inside their apartment. In the next room, in her crib, baby Courtney was found completely unharmed. There were no signs of forced entry. Whoever had come into that apartment had not broken a window or forced a lock. Kathy had let her killer in, or her killer already had a way inside. If there was no break-in, then Kathy knew the person who did this. So why could no one find him? The investigation was vast. The Michigan State Police and the Three Rivers Police Department collected fingerprints, a bloody footprint, and DNA from the scene. Crime scene technicians described it as one of the bloodier scenes they had worked. Thousands of people were interviewed and fingerprinted over the years. An FBI behavioral unit profiled the killer as someone likely local and likely known to Kathy. An early suspect, a former boyfriend, was looked at and cleared, and then the case simply stopped moving. The National DNA Database produced nothing through the 2000s. The killer's profile existed, but it belonged to no one the system could see. So how do you find a man who has never once been entered into any database? In May of 2022, the Michigan State Police offered the Three Rivers Department a cold case grant for forensic genetic genealogy testing. The DNA evidence, including a bloody fingerprint, was sent to Othram, the Texas lab built for exactly this kind of work. Othram's genome sequencing and in-house genealogy team produced a report in January of 2023 that narrowed the entire suspect pool down to a single family, the Waters brothers. Detectives moved through the family quickly. 3 brothers were checked and cleared. That left 1. Robert Odell Waters, 53 years old, living in Beaufort, South Carolina. Investigators obtained search warrants for his DNA and fingerprints. The results closed the case. His DNA matched the crime scene profile, and his fingerprint matched a bloody print left on the telephone in Kathy's bedroom. What had Robert Waters been doing for 35 years? The answer was unsettling in its ordinariness. In 1988, Waters had been a teenager, a high school classmate of Kathy's fiancé, Mike Warner. Warner later told police that Waters had once shown up unannounced at the couple's apartment about a month before Kathy was killed. By 2023, Robert Waters was a married father of 2 who owned a plumbing business in South Carolina. He had no criminal record. He had spent 35 years living a quiet, respectable life, never once leaving the kind of trace that an old-fashioned investigation could catch. Robert Waters was arrested in Beaufort on April 30th, 2023, on an open murder warrant. He cooperated calmly with the officers, but the case would never reach a courtroom. On May 6, 2023, just over 5 days after his arrest and before he could be transferred to Michigan, Waters took his own life in his jail cell. He had not been placed on suicide watch. What he left behind offered no real answers, only a strange and quiet final note. On the table in his cell, guards found religious pamphlets, their titles centered on the theme of forgiveness. Waters never gave a statement. He never explained why, as a teenager, he had walked into the apartment of a classmate's fiancée and ended her life. The motive went into the cell with him, and the families were left with a name but no reason. The case was closed. Kathy's daughter, Courtney, the infant who had slept unharmed through that night, grew up and has spoken publicly about the mother she never had the chance to know, finally able to attach a name to the loss that had shaped her entire life. The next case also waited decades for the science to arrive, and the answer it produced had been gone almost 20 years. Laura Kempton. A young woman came home alone after a night out, and an intruder broke down her door. Her case sat unsolved for more than 4 decades, and by the time DNA finally named the man responsible, he had already been dead for years. Laura Kempton was 23 years old, living in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. She was enrolled at a local beauty school and had recently been hired at a gift store in town. Investigators would later describe her as an outgoing free spirit with a big personality and a love for new wave fashion. A young woman in the middle of building her life. In the early morning hours of September 28, 1981, Laura returned alone to her Chapel Street apartment after a night out with a friend. An intruder broke down her door. Laura was attacked and killed inside her own home. She was discovered later that morning by a police officer who had come to her door for an entirely unrelated reason: to serve her with a court summons. How does a killer break down a door in a populated neighborhood and simply vanish? The Portsmouth Police Department pursued the case for decades, chasing hundreds of leads through the years. The case was sometimes informally linked to another unsolved Portsmouth killing the following year, a pairing that deepened the unease in a small city. The New Hampshire State Police Forensic Lab developed a male DNA profile from the scene, the single strongest piece of evidence the investigation held. But once again, the national database held no match. The profile was complete and completely anonymous, a perfect description of a man no record could name. What do you do when you have the killer's DNA but the database stays silent for 40 years? You wait for a different kind of search. In 2022, the Portsmouth Police, working with the State Forensic Lab, the Attorney General's Cold Case Unit, and a company called Identifinders International, turned to forensic genetic genealogy. The groundwork actually stretched back further than that. The president of Identifinders explained the long arc of the effort, noting that the firm's initial genealogy work in 2017 had provided the basis for the later, more advanced analysis, and praised the forensic genealogist who carried it through. The case had been quietly building toward an answer for years before the public ever heard a name. In May of 2022, the genealogical profile matched 2 relatives in a public database. From there, investigators built their way to a name. And in June of 2023, autopsy blood from a man named Ronnie James Lee was confirmed as a match to multiple samples from the 1981 scene, including a cigarette butt left behind. The State Attorney General announced the case solved on July 20th, 2023. But who was Ronnie James Lee? And why had he never surfaced? Ronnie James Lee had been born in Florida and served in the Army until 1981, working as a security officer in Portsmouth around the time Laura was killed. He did have a later record. He was convicted in 1987 of charges connected to a break-in and attack in another New Hampshire town, and was imprisoned for a period at the end of the 1980s. But none of that record had ever connected him to Laura Kempton's case. And for 40 years, his name stayed off the list entirely. And by the time the science could, it was too late for a courtroom. Ronnie James Lee had died in February of 2005 at the age of 45. The technology that would eventually identify him as Laura's killer had not even existed at the time of his death. He had lived out his entire life and ended it, with the case still officially unsolved behind him. The Attorney General was direct about what the outcome would have been in any other circumstance, stating that if Ronnie Lee were still alive, his office would bring criminal charges against him. Instead, the case was simply marked solved, an answer delivered to Laura Kempton's family more than 4 decades after the night her door was broken down. The man had a name at last. Even though he had slipped past every consequence the law might have brought, the next case reached back almost as far and was funded not by the police, but by a non-profit determined to give forgotten victims their names back. Melanie White. A young mother was found in a desert wash outside Las Vegas, killed by a stranger who left only his DNA behind. Her case sat untouched for nearly 30 years until a non-profit paid for the test that finally named him. Melanie White was 27 years old, a young mother of an infant son. In the spring of 1994, she had recently moved to Las Vegas with her boyfriend, arriving from out of state. People who knew her remembered a stylish young woman who loved fashion and was searching for a new career and a fresh start in a new city. On August 27, 1994, two hikers near the entrance to a national recreation area about 10 miles east of Las Vegas came upon Melanie's body in a desert wash. She had been killed and dragged from a vehicle into the wash. She had last been seen alive the night before. How do you find a killer in a desert where the scene itself offers almost nothing? In 1994, the Lades went nowhere. The case went cold and stayed that way for years. Then, in 2010, cold case detectives with the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department resubmitted the scene evidence for the standard DNA testing of the era. The lab produced an unknown male profile, and detectives uploaded it to the national database. As in so many of these cases, the database returned nothing. The profile sat there, complete and nameless, for another decade. What finally moved a case that the system itself had given up on? It was not a police budget. It was a non-profit. In 2021, an organization called the Vegas Justice League, founded the previous year by an entrepreneur and his wife, funded the Las Vegas Police Department's submission of Melanie White's case to Othram. The group had been built specifically to pay for the kind of advanced testing that strained police resources, and Melanie's case became one of its projects. The Texas lab applied its genome sequencing and its in-house genealogy team to the unknown profile and began producing leads, branch by branch, where the database had produced nothing at all. From there, detectives did the follow-up work, using comparison DNA from extended relatives to close the distance toward one man. On August 26, 2024, they confirmed their suspect, nearly 30 years to the day after Melanie's body had been found in the wash. So, who was the man the desert had hidden for 3 decades? His name was Arthur Joseph Lavery. He had grown up in Las Vegas, attended a local high school, and had been a grown man at the time of the killing. He had a prior arrest in the city for an assault. Some of Melanie's friends had been seen with her in an area near where Lavery lived the night before she died, though investigators have not established any direct prior connection between Lavery and Melanie. He had lived in the same city as the unsolved case for decades, an ordinary local man whose name no one had ever written down, hidden not by distance, but simply by the limits of the old methods. And as in so many of these stories, the answer came too late for a trial. Arthur Joseph Lavery had died in May of 2021 of complications from illness, 3 years before the genealogy work finally attached his name to the case. There would be no arrest and no courtroom. The case was simply closed. What the Melanie White case left behind was a model. Police officials in Las Vegas have credited the Vegas Justice League's funding with directly leading to a string of cold case solves in the city, cases that the department, working alone with limited resources, might never have been able to pay to test. The nonprofit's founder told a local newspaper that dozens of cold cases across the country had been solved through the group's funding efforts. For Melanie White, a young mother who had come to Las Vegas chasing a fresh start, it meant that 30 years after a stranger ended her life in the desert, that stranger finally had a name. Her surviving family, including her brothers, had an answer at last, even if they would never have the satisfaction of seeing the man face a judge. The next case did not rely on a family tree at all. It was solved by a vacuum, and a piece of granite the killer had gripped with his bare hand. Crystal Beslanowicz. A teenager was killed along a Utah river and left in the open, and for 18 years, the only clue was a profile no name could be attached to. The breakthrough came from a machine that could lift a killer's DNA off solid rock. Crystal Lynn Beslanowicz was 17 years old, originally from Spokane, Washington. By her family's own account, her early life had been difficult. She had been in Utah only about 5 months at the time of her death, living in the Salt Lake City area and going through a hard and unstable stretch of her life. Late on December 14, 1995, Crystal told her boyfriend she was going to a convenience store for food. She never came back. The next morning, December 15th, a rancher and his son found Crystal's body along the Provo River near Midway, Utah, roughly 45 miles southeast of Salt Lake City. She had been killed with granite rocks taken from the riverbed itself. One small, strange detail stood out at the scene. Her socks had been left neatly folded nearby. How do you trace a killer who used the river itself as his weapon? For 18 years, no one could. Investigators looked hard at the people closest to Crystal. Her boyfriend was an early suspect, in part because he had initially given police a false name for her. Another man who had shown an unhealthy fixation on her was also investigated. Both were eventually cleared. The case belonged, more than anyone, to Wasatch County Sheriff Todd Bonner, who had been the original detective on the scene and who later said the case haunted him for his entire career. In 2008, scientists managed to pull a partial male profile from the rocks used in the killing. It matched neither of the cleared suspects. It matched no one in the database at all. The case stalled once again, held back by the simple fact that a rough stone is a very difficult surface to read. How do you get a usable profile off the rough surface of a rock? That was the wall the case had hit. Standard swabbing simply could not recover enough material from porous granite. Then, in 2013, a Salt Lake City forensic company turned to a new tool, a wet vacuum collection system designed to lift trace amounts of DNA from difficult, porous surfaces. They applied it to the granite rocks from the scene, focusing on the spot where the killer would have gripped the stone. The machine pulled up a full male DNA profile from that grip point. This time, when the profile was run through the national database, it did not come back empty. In January of 2013, it returned a direct match. The name was Joseph Michael Simpson, then 46 years old, living in Florida. And the match revealed something chilling about the timing. Joseph Michael Simpson had a prior record. He had been convicted of an unrelated killing in Utah years earlier, and he had been released on parole in April of 1995. Crystal Beslanowicz was killed that December. Simpson had been free for only a matter of months. He had worked as a shuttle bus driver at a Utah resort, a job that gave him a working familiarity with the very area along the Provo River where Crystal's body was left. Sheriff Bonner flew to Florida and surveilled Simpson for 4 days, waiting until he discarded a cigarette butt that could serve as a fresh comparison sample. It confirmed the match. Simpson was arrested in September of 2013 and extradited to Utah. This case, unlike so many of the others, reached a courtroom. In September of 2016, a Utah jury convicted Joseph Michael Simpson of aggravated murder. The jurors deliberated for under an hour before returning their verdict. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case became an early and high-profile demonstration of the wet vacuum DNA technology, a method that has since been used to crack other cases once thought permanently unsolvable. For Crystal Beslanowicz, the man who left her along the Provo River did not, in the end, escape. The river he had used as a weapon gave up his identity to a machine. The final case is the one that changed everything, because the same science that catches the guilty was used, for the first time, to free a man who was innocent. Angie Dodge. A young woman was killed in her apartment, and the man convicted of the crime spent 20 years in prison for something he did not do. The technology that finally found the real killer also became the first of its kind to free an innocent man. Angie Dodge was 18 years old, living alone in an apartment in Idaho Falls, Idaho. On June 13, 1996, after Angie failed to arrive for work, two co-workers went to her apartment and found that she had been killed. Investigators recovered foreign DNA at the scene, biological evidence left by her attacker. The investigation that followed became one of the most troubling in the state's history. Police focused on a 20-year-old man named Christopher Tapp, who was part of the same loose social circle as Angie and had been seen with her shortly before her death. Over more than 100 hours of questioning across 9 separate sessions, with investigators feeding him details of the crime scene, threatening him with the death penalty and dangling promises of immunity, Tapp eventually confessed and implicated others. But here is the problem that should have stopped the case cold. None of the physical evidence connected Christopher Tapp to the crime. His DNA never matched the foreign DNA from the scene. How does a man get convicted when the actual evidence points away from him? It happened anyway. In December of 1998, Christopher Tapp was convicted of murder and sentenced to 30 years to life. He went to prison for a killing he had not committed. Over the years that followed, an extraordinary range of people came to the same conclusion, that his confession had been coerced out of him. False confession experts, retired FBI agents, the Idaho Innocence Project, and most remarkably of all, Angie Dodge's own mother, Carol Dodge, who studied the recordings of the interrogations and concluded that the young man in prison was innocent of the crime. In 2017, after Tapp had served exactly 20 years behind bars, his conviction connected to the attack was vacated and his sentence reduced to time served. He walked free at last, but he walked free still formally tied to a murder case that had never truly been solved. So if Christopher Tapp did not do it, who did? And could anyone still prove it? After Tapp's release, the Idaho Falls police reopened the case. Carol Dodge, the victim's own mother, persuaded a genealogist named C.C. Moore, working with Parabon Nanolabs, to take it on. Moore's genealogical search through public databases pointed toward the descendants of one particular family. Investigators eliminated 6 known male descendants, one by one. Then a deeper, months-long investigation revealed a 7th, previously unknown grandson, a man who had never appeared in any family record the searchers first built. His name was Brian Lee Dripps Sr. Police surveilled Dripps in Caldwell, Idaho, and recovered a cigarette butt he discarded from his car window. The DNA on it was a complete match to the crime scene evidence, and the truth of where Brian Dripps had been all along was staggering. In 1996, Brian Lee Dripps Sr. had lived directly across the street from Angie Dodge. He had been interviewed during the initial canvass of the neighborhood in the days after the killing, and then dismissed. He had been there the entire time. When investigators questioned him after the DNA match, he confessed. He said he had acted alone. He had never even met Christopher Tapp, the man who had spent 20 years in prison for his crime. In 2021, Brian Dripps pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to 20 years to life. And the case made history. 2 months after Dripps was arrested, a judge formally vacated Christopher Tapp's murder conviction entirely and declared him cleared of any role in the crime. It is widely recognized as the first case in United States history in which forensic genetic genealogy was used to exonerate a person who had been wrongfully convicted. Christopher Tapp went on to receive a multi-million-dollar settlement and a formal written apology from the city that had imprisoned him. And he became an advocate for others who had been wrongfully convicted. The same tool that had named a guilty man across these 10 cases had, in this one, reached back into the past to undo an injustice and give an innocent man his name and his life back. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.